It's May 8th, and that holds a special reverence to a lot of people because it is the anniversary, the 75th anniversary, in fact, of Victory in Europe Day. VE Day marked the end of World War II in the European theater and the Allied defeat against Nazism, fascism, and the expansionist policies of Adolf Hitler. And I'm joined, of course, by Salim Mansur, who is a professor emeritus at Western University, to discuss the 75 years between May 8th, 1945, and today, May 8th, 2020. 75 years later, it's an entire lifetime. Things have changed so dramatically compared to what things were like back then. And it's time to put it into a context, a perspective, and look at the intervening 75 years. And it's especially poignant today, given that we are effectively living in a dictatorship today in many parts of the world, with the imposition of, or the passing or enacting of the Emergencies Act here in Canada, which basically gives dictatorial powers to the Prime Minister, and in the provinces as well. And we are living under a lockdown. People are being arrested left, right, and center for doing things that are what would be considered normal. So let's put that in perspective, the 75 years from the end of World War II in Europe to today, Salim. But before we begin, I'd just like to remind our viewers that they should visit our website at justrightmedia.org to see all of our social media links. They're in the description on the video below. And have a look at how many times Salim has been a contributor on our show. I'm not going to call you a guest anymore. You're a contributor to Just Right Media, because this will be your 85th contribution to this channel, whether it's the audio show that we broadcast on shortwave or our videos. So welcome, Salim. So let's get right into it. What do you want to talk about in the 75 years, in that span, that strikes you the most, that it's worthy of discussion today?
Robert, thank you very much for doing this. I mean, it is very appropriate in so many ways. And again, of course, everything is dependent on how much time do we have. But it is so appropriate to have at least a moment together and talk about and reflect upon where we have arrived in these 75 years. Our parents' generation and grandparents' generation, that is known quite rightly, are the greatest generation. 75 years ago, those who survived were the survivors of the greatest war that has been fought in the history, I would say, of mankind, and a totalitarian power, an evil totalitarian power was defeated. We can only imagine if that totalitarian power had won instead of being defeated, and its founders having blown their brains apart, as Hitler did on April 30th in his bunker in Berlin, and the others around him, those who could not escape the wreckage of the Third Reich, were picked up by the Allied powers, and then subsequently they were tried at the famous Nuremberg trial, and many of them were then given capital punishment. That we, in a sense, if they had not been defeated, ironically, headed into where we have arrived 75 years later, in a soft despotism. I mean, that is so, I mean, it couldn't have been imagined, say, a year ago, on this anniversary day, that we are today, as you and I speak. We are in what is, in a sense, a totalitarian society. And this is not in some third world country that we are talking about. We are in the midst of a complete lockdown of a sort that only a totalitarian state and a totalitarian power would imagine and would use a pretext, in this case, the Wuhan virus or the coronavirus emanating out of China, to shut down an economy and civil life. And this has been done in the countries which were the Allied powers, which are today the G7 countries. We are not talking again about Rhodesia or Zimbabwe or Bangladesh or Afghanistan. We're talking about Canada, a G7 country, United States, the greatest power in the world. And so from this perspective, Robert, where we are, to look back on the end of the war and where we have arrived, I think is a very, very important need to reflect. I'm sure historians are going to ponder if we don't come out of this and we do not again take back our freedoms, our constitutional rights, and go back to again rebuilding from the wreckage. We are in a wreckage, from the wreckage of what we have turned our countries into once again a liberal democracy based upon individual rights and freedom that we cherish, you and I cherish, the Enlightenment values upon which the Western world was built, then we are lost. We are lost. The rest of the 21st century is lost. What Hitler could not have imagined is now being delivered by the Chinese. And here we are, you and I, in a lockdown. We cannot, even if we get together for a coffee, we have to maintain that social distance, or somebody will come, as happened, I believe, yesterday or day before yesterday in Dallas, Texas. A woman was arrested all because she had opened up a salon and said that she cannot stand by and not feed her children. And
yes, so as a matter of fact, Salim, I just saw just before we sat down here that she was actually released from jail yesterday. So that's good news in that respect, in the sense that sometimes the law can work in your favor, even though you meet a judge who is rather vindictive.
That is a good news for the lady. I'm sure a lot of prayers were up there for her, and I believe all the mainstream politicians in Texas on the Republican side, the Texas governor, the Texas attorney general, and a majority of Texas state assembly people who are Republicans had expressed their disgust and demanded her release. So I'm glad that happened. But the fact that happened is symbolic. And what is happening in California or in New York, in California, the lockdown on the beaches and the struggle that is going on, as people are wanting to come out of, in a sense, their home prison, back into the living a normal life. And the governors and the politicians are saying no. And the same situation exists in much of the world. So symbolically, yes, I mean, it is a very telling moment of where we have arrived. And that's what I was spinning through my mind. That as our capacity in terms of what we can do with technology has gone far beyond any imagination of the greatest generation. The greatest virtue of the greatest generation was they put their life on the line to defend freedom. And that story is more or less being forgotten.
It's true. They did put their lives on the line. 1 million Canadians were in uniform for Canada against the Axis powers. And it begs asking the question, what were they fighting for? Because at the time, Canada was no reflection of what it is today. Today, people would say that Canada is an open, diverse society, no borders, very socialist in its programs. What defines Canada for a lot of people is universal health care, believe it or not. And that didn't even exist when Canada joined its partners against the Axis powers. So we didn't fight for the socialist programs. We didn't fight for universal health care. We didn't fight for open borders. We didn't fight for United Nations, because that really didn't exist in the extent that it does today. And so here we are today in a world that is so alien to somebody who was living in the 40s. If somebody from the 40s, and there's still some of them alive today, but if someone who was 20 years old in the 40s with the freedoms that he had is all of a sudden taken from that time, put into this situation, I wonder what he or she would think. Quite frankly, I think that they would be appalled at where we've come in 75 years, wouldn't you?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you go back and read the literature from the period and before, leading up to the period, and you trace the lives of the people, trace the life of the leaders of the Allied powers, Britain, the foremost. Then, when United States came into action, the leaders in the United States. So the Allied powers and what values shaped them, what were their understanding politically, intellectually, morally about the world, in contrast to where we are today, 75 years later, would be very evident of what I believe is, in some sense, the main story and the more interesting story. There has been a vast growth of wealth in the world. Poverty has been reduced. I mean, if we can talk about China in terms of the coronavirus and its culpability, but there's the other side, which is also needs to be mentioned, that there that at no period in history has there been such a huge shift of people from abject poverty to, coming closer and closer towards some sort of a middle class status. But the other story, which to me is much more fascinating, is the story about and reflection about what has happened to where we began from, our understanding about, our care about, our passionate devotion to, and wanting to defend what's led to the war. I mean, the Europeans, Britain, for instance, under the prime ministership of the conservative prime ministers and the Labour prime minister during the period between the two world wars and the rise of Hitler's Germany, they went, they turned themselves into pretzel trying to find ways to appease Hitler, till the final picture we have of Neville Chamberlain in Munich saying that he has peace on his hand, even as they sold off Czechoslovakia to the Nazi regime. So there was that situation, and we can explain that, understand that literature is washed out, that the generation that had come out of World War I didn't want to step into another war that would have been even more devastating, but trying to avoid that war that would be even more devastating, they did get into that war, and that was World War II. And looking back at it, the war was, when Churchill became the prime minister in 1940, in May 1940, and when he came to Newfoundland, to your native island, in the spring of late spring, early summer of 1940, May of 1940, he came to Newfoundland to meet with the American president, Franklin Roosevelt, and signed the Lend-Lease Agreement, and what then later on became the Atlantic Charter. America was not at war, and it was the American support that Churchill was looking for, and President Roosevelt was willing to provide that support and did provide that support. But the call for the Atlantic Charter was about freedom. It was a war that would be fought against, as in Churchill's words and in the way Churchill framed it, against this totalitarian, this inhumane, this Nazi power. And he got up in the parliament and said that if Hitler was to invade hell, he would have good words to say about the devil. So that was looking towards at some point in time with alliance with Soviet Union, communist Soviet Union, knowing fully well that the Soviet Union was the other totalitarian power, but Hitler had to be defeated. And so there was no ambiguity. Once the Americans got into the war after Pearl Harbor and Germany declared war on America, there was no ambiguity anymore that it was about freedom. It was about the values of enlightenment embodied in the American Constitution, in the British parliamentary system, of which we are ourselves, Canada, is a child of that. We are part of that Enlightenment age and a child of that Enlightenment history. So it was a war for freedom, and freedom won. But freedom means nothing unless it is individual freedom. And so looking back and then tracing it, in a nutshell, we can say what has happened is that the Western world, and here there is no exception, America is very much at the center of it, that the Western world in these 75 years lost its moral center.
Mm-hmm.
And,
they lost the moral
that
compass.
we can point out in detail.
And you and I talked about this the other day, and who is to blame for that loss of the moral center? And it came down to everybody, more or less, from the teachers who no longer properly teach history or selectively teach history and politics properly, to the priests and the religious figures who are not taking sides when it comes to the restrictions that we have, to our politicians. But especially of late, we see that one of the biggest culprits in this loss of a moral compass is the media, who are printing and disseminating lies, who are distorting the truth, who are taking the past and looking back on it, to use their words, with a lens of social justice and condemning everything that our forefathers did, and then twisting it into some sort of evil act that that happened in the past and must be rectified, whether it's not giving reparations to the Aboriginal population for bringing the measles over, or having them put them into boarding schools. And we look at these past events, and we try to find blame. But for me, it's like, it's my neighbor. 70%, in one of the latest polls, I think it was by Global News, said 70% agreed wholeheartedly with the way that Justin Trudeau has been handling this crisis. Now, mind you, it's Global News. They're part of the fake news problem. So I suspect, though, that it is still quite a large number, considering during the election, 2/3 of the electorate voted left-wing NDP or left-wing Liberal. And if you think about it, 100% of them, or 98.4% of them, voted for left-wing Conservatives as well. So NDP, Liberal, Conservative, all left-wing. And so we're in this morass. We are in a minority here, Salim, you and I, and some of the friends that we have who study history and politics, put it into perspective and context, know where we've gone, can see where we're going, try to give a warning out there to people. And it's getting quite disheartening.
So, Robert, the large issue is not about Canadians re-elected Justin Trudeau, or the Americans were about to elect Hillary Clinton, or might end up electing Joe Biden in the coming November election, and so on and so forth. The larger issue is what has happened to the West. That's in this 75 years. On the one side, as I pointed out, there's been an immense technological leap forward, but the science and the physics was already, dealt with even before the war had ended. So, for instance, to put it in symbolic and metaphorical sense. The Prime Minister of England during the war, that is Winston Churchill, he begins his life as a young man, goes and joins the army. He was born in the 1870s in Victorian England, joins the army, and his first military encounter is as a cavalryman riding a horse, to go to war or to battle. In other words, from how far back you want to go, let me go back to Alexander the Great and the army, which was cavalry and foot soldiers, to Winston Churchill on a horseback, cavalry and soldier. Nothing substantive had changed.
I think we got rid of the elephants, though.
Pardon me?
I think we got rid of the elephants.
Yeah, well, elephant, cavalry, mule, donkeys, whatever you wanted. But the soldier, the cavalry was the vanguard of any military force. Napoleon's army or Alexander the Great's army or the British army, etc., etc. But here is the man who symbolizes it, who begins his career on a horseback as a military officer, cavalryman, is the one who is in power, where the mechanization, the technological development has come about, and he has himself seen through it. In some ways, he was responsible for, as a member of the British cabinet, for the making of the Air Force, for making of, oil-fired, from steam-powered to oil-powered naval fleet, to ultimately the nuclear age. Second World War ended with the A-bomb. So the science had already been established, and we have made tremendous gain about it. But we no longer have a Winston Churchill in our midst. We no longer have, an Eisenhower or Roosevelt or any of that generation. So when we talk about the greatest generation, what has happened? On the one side, we have made advances. On the other side, there is a steep slope in the culture. And as I've always maintained, that culture is upstream and economics and politics and everything else is downstream. And so we have to get back to that issue. That's the big story. It is that we, as I said in my opening remarks, we have lost the moral center. Now, look at it. I mean, we can divide up the 75 years into portions to look at it, and we can then identify how the problem escalated. But within the problem of escalation, that is a culture, means people, you and I, and everybody around us. And you can talk about the media, you can talk about whoever you want. It is about the people, and the people who are educated, who are taught from kindergarten all the way to university. And I spent my life in university, So it is education. What has happened to the education in the West? Because education makes the culture in the West. And that is a massively interesting and profound story. People have written about it. I mean, one of the most famous books from about 40 years ago was Alan Bloom's book, which is one of my favorite books, The Closing of the American Mind. I mean, it's very symbolic, the title, The Closing of the American Mind. So where and how did this happen? Why did this happen? If I might put it in the following sense, we take the 75 years and we break it up into segments. And one segment, I would say, where the shift becomes more and more noticeable, and then we are gone, we are lost, till, you might say, the election of President Trump is the beginning of, in some ways, taking back, in the case of America, America first, taking back America, that is the America of the greatest generation that was lost, and to take that back. In Canada, we don't have that movement. In Europe, we don't have that movement. So in America, that movement is there, the taking back. So what are we taking back? And the segment. let's say 1960, that is roughly 15 years after the end of the war. The greatest generation is still alive. They're still in power. And then half a century later, the American election of 2008. 1960 president, John F. Kennedy becomes the president. He's the first Catholic president in America. To say that he's the first Catholic president means, what was America before that? There was a common culture and a sense of belonging, a bond, a thread that held America together. And the word used to be called WASP, white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant. America's culture was Protestant Christianity. Catholics were there in huge numbers, but the culture was Protestant, Anglo-Saxon, English. 1960, America was not an open immigration, borderless world. The America that went to war was still as homogeneous in 1945 as the Americans who fought the Civil War in 1860-64. You see? So it is the same American, and I'm talking about culturally, I'm talking about ethnically, I'm talking about in terms of the religious values, in terms of the political values. It is America is pretty much in that sense consistent. Somebody born in the 1920s and come of teenage at the time of the end of the war would still be able to relate without much difference to the generation of Abraham Lincoln, both in terms of literature, the books that he was being taught, the curriculum that was being addressed at the university, the sense of history that you're talking about, the love for the Constitution, the reverence for the founding fathers, etc., etc., etc. So John F. Kennedy is the first Catholic president. He had to go around. He was a member of the greatest generation. He had fought in the war. He had made a name for himself. He had become an iconic hero, as the commander of that famous naval boat, PT-109. And he had survived. His older brother, Joseph Kennedy, was a bomber pilot that was lost somewhere over the English Channel or in Europe during the war, etc. So this man comes back home from the war, runs for politics. His father was a well-known man, etc., etc. And they came from a upper patrician class. They had the money. The father had made money. And so he goes into politics. He becomes elected as a senator. He's young, handsome. He is a writer. He's won the Pulitzer Prize for his book Profile in Courage, and so on and so forth. And he runs for the presidency. But he has to go around America and convince the main institutions of America. And one of the most important institutions of America was the church and the churchmen. And he had to go and convince them that if he is elected, he's American and he's America first. He is not and will not be an agent of the Vatican, of the Catholic Church, etc. So that's the world we are in 1960. This is before the Vietnam War. This is America that is still the greatest power on earth, even though the Soviets are trying to catch up with it. And by the time John Kennedy becomes the president, the Sputnik race has become the race for the satellite, and the space had become, and the Russians had launched the Sputnik. And so the question became, is America falling behind? And one of the first tasks would be, after John Kennedy won the presidency, would be that it would be in his decade, that is the 1960s, America will land man on the moon. You remember that? That was the promise that was made and the challenge that was it. And it happened in his decade in 1969. 50 years, 2008, America elects Obama as the president, the first black president, the first Catholic president, the first black president. Obama's story is completely different from the story of John F. Kennedy. Obama is not of the greatest generation. Obama comes with all sorts of question marks. His background, he's a communist, or he is, pro-Marxist. He is a follower of Saul Alinsky, a Leninist communist thinker in Chicago. He is a community organizer. He belongs to the generation, and he's educated by the generation of which Alan Bloom would talk about the closing of the American mind. What has happened in this 50 years? In this 50 years, we're talking about culturally. America goes into Vietnam War. It is the most divisive war, unlike the war of the greatest generation. It becomes the most divisive war. It is a war that unleashes all sorts of issues that we are still struggling with. The West is still struggling with. America is still struggling with. There is assassination. Politics become extremely divisive. John F. Kennedy is killed. His brother Robert is killed. Martin Luther is killed. Malcolm X is killed. There's the rise of the civil rights movement. Cities are burning, And in the midst of all of these things, if you pull up all of these threads together, what you find is the America of the greatest generation, the America that won the war, and the culture that won the war is now fraying. There is the rise of a new political movement, feminism. There is the coming of the in medicine. There is the coming of the pill that, in a sense, is both emancipates women in the sense that she can control the choice of being a mother or not being a mother. In that sense, the pill liberates her and opens up a whole horizon for women that was not there. But it is also divisive. It is left wing. And that movement emerges alongside the movement of the civil rights movement and anti-war movement. And the thrust of these movements are that the American culture is negative. The American culture is stained with the sins of slavery. The American culture is one of white patriarchy. The American culture needs to be not only revised, but blown apart in a sense, and that's the movement that evolved. That's the generation to which Obama belonged, Bill Clinton belonged, George Bush belonged, that's George Bush 43 belonged, and Donald Trump belonged, and that's the generation that you and I belong. In April of 1966, if my memory serves me correct, Time magazine, which was the premier magazine. Now nobody cares for Time in that sense as it used to be, but Time magazine was, in a sense, that defined time and life. Those of us who belong or who grew up in the 1960s and 1970s, we were teenagers and coming in of age, we know this was the time and the life of the two magazines that people read, people looked up to. They were, in more sense, the magazine that shaped the conversation of the day, of the month, of the year. So in April of 1966, Time had a cover story which became huge and controversial and generated a lot of discussion. It was a black iconic cover in red bold letter, "Is God dead?" Well, that question was not simply rhetorical. This was at the heart of it. It was the question, where is Christianity? Where is our belief system? Who are we? And that's what I'm pointing out, that at the middle of this the 75 years, the trust that was taking shape in the world, in the Western world, the West was known before the war, before the two world wars, was still a Christendom. After the war, after World War II, we call it the West. It is no longer Christendom. There is a cultural shift that has taken place that is so profound, in which 500 years, that is from the Enlightenment, I'm saying 500 years roughly, say the iconic date would be, say, 1492, the discovery of America, Columbus sailing, and the coming of what would later on be called the Eurocentric Age. Europe would be the center of the making of the modern world. And 500 years, from 1492 to say 1992, that was the 500th anniversary. And so it falls within the 75-year period. The Eurocentric age is over. And with that Eurocentric age is also, in that sense, the decentering and the dismantling of Christendom. And that magazine of April 1966, Is God Dead?, was in so many ways prophetic, Robert. Today the churches are empty. In Europe, the churches are empty. Last year, at this time of the year, Notre Dame was burning. The church that symbolized the greatness of France for 1,000 years, almost, was burning. It is shut down. Nobody goes there. It is simply a place where visitors go, a whole lot of them being nouveau riche Chinese coming to Paris, who go with their iPhones, taking pictures of Eiffel Tower and Notre Dame. But what these things represented is no longer thought about, no longer cared, no longer spoken. The children don't read about it, We grew up, and my generation, but before that, all of the generation before that, for instance, grew up reading, Victor Hugo, The Hunchback of Notre Dame, centered around the Notre Dame Cathedral, and it was not simply a novel, it was a record, a history of France and Notre Dame, told in a fictional sense to the story of, Esmeralda and Quasimodo, the bell ringer of Notre Dame, but the symbolism, and that's what has happened. And what ironically has come through, has won, and that's why we are sitting here in prison in a soft totalitarian situation that nobody of the greatest generation could have imagined that this is what they fought for, is the result that the last 75 years, it is Marxist education that has deconstructed, dismantled, and destroyed what made the West the greatest civilization since Rome.
I
That's
heard
what has
that
happened.
there was one argument put forward that people from the West turned on themselves and the West started to eat its young precisely because of the Second World War, precisely because right in the heart, the cultural heart of Western civilization, there came Nazism, there came a Hitler, there came anti-Semitism, and it embroiled the entire planet. And so people would look at that history and say, look what the West has wrought, and then tried to dismantle the West, throwing out the baby with the bathwater. Hitler and Nazism being the bathwater, of course, the evil, but they threw out the baby as well, the cultural history, as you say, the Christendom, the nature of our very thought and beliefs and ideas, which put man on the moon in one sense, but also put Jews in the oven in the other. So they couldn't distinguish between the two, and so we are left with what we have today.
Well, I mean, as I just finished saying, all of the issue that you're raising has to be analyzed. But the question is, analyzed by whom and by what perspective, and who are the teachers doing the analysis? And if the people who fought Nazi Germany, and then there's the same people who not only fought Nazi Germany and defeated Nazi Germany, I'm talking about the greatest generation, they also laid the foundation and the institutional requirements to confront the second totalitarian power, which was the Soviet Union. And then what they put together eventually triumphed. Soviet Union no longer exists. It disintegrated, collapsed, and was defeated. So the greatest generation won two of the greatest victories over two of the most evil powers in terms of what the world has witness and what we can understand. I mean, we cannot talk about, say, Tamerlane or Genghis Khan in the same context as Stalin and Hitler, and then later on Mao Zedong. So the greatest generation won those two immense victories and saved all of us without any distinction. I mean, imagine if Nazi Germany had won, and as I was pointing out in my earlier remark, then people in India, people in Africa, people, you know, right around the world would not only be termed Untermenschen, you know, the impure ethnicity and race, they would all be standing up and doing Heil Hitler and be slave labor for the superior Aryan race, you know. So that would have been the outcome. If Soviet Union had won the war, then, you know, it would be again Marxist-Leninist dictatorship of the proletariat and gulags, you know. The defining issue then comes down to, which has always been the case, it's about freedom. It's about individual rights and freedom. And so the conflation that has happened, that, the American culture, the culture that we're talking about, which was the culture of the greatest generation that they had inherited and that they protected, and that they passed it on to their subsequent generation who made a dog's breakfast out of it. That this culture, by the post-great generation, talking about this is white patriarchy, this is racist, this is, you know, Ku Klux Klan. This is the argument that our children has been taught, that Sir Johnny MacDonald is responsible for the genocide of the First Nation, you know. This sort of argument, where did it come from? Well, this is what I'm saying. This is the Marxism-Leninism. This has not been challenged. This has penetrated our university system. I'm speaking from within the trenches. I'm not talking about people who are engaged in the study of physics and chemistry. I'm talking about the people who are engaged in the study of history, in the study of culture, in the study of religion. They are the ones who have basically taken seeds of the minds of the young people and produced a generation, several generations now, who can go ahead and elect a Justin Trudeau. That's the challenge that we are faced with.
Well, let's then ask ourselves, how do we get out of this? I mean, you and I are doing our part, I believe, in trying to get these thoughts out there, or at least the questions out there. You've written a number of books. You've had a captive audience at the university with your students. But what can we do, all of society, to turn things around? Because right now we've gone from tyranny to tyranny.
Well, we have to get our politics right. And getting our politics right is, you know, probe our entire cultural matrix and begin engaging and talking about this. And I think that's what you and I are doing. And this has to be done, you know, openly and across the board.
But
and
politics,
there
Salim,
are people.
So, Salim, sorry to interrupt you, but you said earlier that politics is downstream from culture. So from where I sit, as long as we have a culture of the extreme left and Marxism, our politics, we can't get it right.
You're right, Robert. It is not, when I say politics separated from culture. To get politics right means to be fully aware and focus on what is the cultural foundation upon which this political discussion is going to take place. And so in our conversation, the premise has always been there. It is about the culture of freedom. The culture of freedom is something unique to the West. Culture of freedom does not exist in India. Where it exists in India, it is as a result of the contribution of Britain. It is Britain's legacy. So when the Marxists run down Indian Marxists or anybody else, imperialism and British colonialism and what they did in India, so to speak, in recent times there has been accusations, allegations, and challenges that Britain horribly abused India and generated a famine for which Winston Churchill is held responsible. So the Bengal famine. I don't want to go on that route to discuss, the validity of the arguments. I don't think there is much validity there. But anyhow, those arguments have been made, and it has been circulating in recent times to damage and stain Churchill's reputation as one of the greatest leaders and war leader. But coming back to India and Britain in the colonial relationship, to talk about Bengal famine without talking about all that Britain left behind or Britain's contribution in the making of modern India is, in a sense, to be willfully blind. It is absurd. Modern India is, in many sense, a product of over 200-year presence of Britain in India and British rule in India. And India is today's world's largest democracy because of Britain, not because of India. And so we have to get our politics right. We have to refocus our politics back to the issue of individual rights, individual freedom. I must point out here in this context, look, the period that I talked about, the half century, the election of John F. Kennedy and the election of Obama in America, during this half century or during this period of 50 years, and it is continuing, Europe, which was the cradle of the modern world, the dominant culture of Europe since 1945, it was there before 1945, but after 1945, one would have imagined they would have learned a lesson. The dominant intellectual culture of Europe has been Marxist. Take France, for instance, which prides itself as a cultural giant and a cultural center in the Western world. And there is reasons for the French to have certain pride in that. There's no taking it away from it. But take France after the liberation, which France would not have been liberated without the Allied help. And de Gaulle would not have walked down Champs-Élysées with the victory parade, once France was liberated in 1944, without the American and the British Army behind him. This is the France whose greatest intellectual heroes and leaders and thinkers were people like Jean-Paul Sartre, a fully confessed Marxist, who remained a Stalinist even after Khrushchev had come out and denounced Stalinism in his famous speech of 1956, which had been, protected and secret speech given to the Soviet Central Committee, and then it was leaked out, or people with connection brought it out to the West. But here it is, Jean-Paul Sartre. And you can keep on naming a whole lot of other people. The Frankfurt School, which was a Marxist school, and many of those people of the Frankfurt School who, during the period of Hitler regime, they escaped Hitler's Germany to come to America and ended up in American universities and colleges. They never reformed. They pushed their Marxist idea through the American system. People like, Theodor Adorno and Herbert Marcuse and others who became, the most read and most celebrated public intellectuals during the period that I'm talking about, in the period after 1960, with the rise of the Vietnam war protests, the anti-war movement, the civil rights movement, the rise of radical feminism, and etc. And with that came, in the 1960s, the opening of American immigration. America was technically a closed society. It was John F. Kennedy who wrote the book, or the book was written for him, it doesn't matter, but it is under his name, a little book called Nation of Immigrants. And it was after his assassination that Lyndon Johnson, who becomes the president, unrolled the Great Society program. And in the heart, or one of the principal policy of the Great Society program was the open border. And America opened its borders, which was then followed by Canada. And so the world was open to come to America, to Canada. And yes, there's both the plus side and the minus side, you might argue, people might say, what are you complaining about, Salim, about opening up the border? You are here as a result of that. And yes, I'm very grateful, that I had the opportunity to come here because of the policies that were adopted in the mid-1960s that led to the open border. But then there are the consequences also, which is, people simply don't have a policy. One has to think about what are the consequences going to be, what are especially the unintended consequences. Well, the unintended consequences are what we are living through. In this 50 years of the open immigration, the coming of the world into America and Canada and Europe, the unintended consequences has been the dilution, the dissolution of that culture that was the culture of the greatest generation, that had come down in that sense pretty much, intact since, you might say, the Civil War, and before the Civil War in the case of America, or in the case of Great Britain, and I've written about this in my book, Delectable Lie, the culture of Britain that had been basically, intact and English. And you knew who was an Englishman, which is what Enoch Powell warned about in 1968, in his famous speech. And so what have been the unintended consequences of that in our universities, in our schools, in our churches, in our media? It has been the culture of freedom has been replaced by the culture of multiculturalism. Multiculturalism is nothing but another form of an assault on the Enlightenment culture by the Marxists. It is now very clear. It should be very clear. And those who engage in denying that are engaged in spreading the Marxist argument. Because how is it Marxian? Marxian and Marxist argument is based upon class and class struggle, pitting one class against the other, the working class against the bourgeois. The bourgeois is the evil class in this framework of the Marxist thinking, So it is group identity. It is not about individual rights. It is about group right. The worker will be free. And who is going to pay for that? The bourgeoisie is going to pay for that, So the group identity, and multiculturalism has been the politics of group identity, and that binding culture, the culture that was based upon the fundamental values. None of the founders of the Enlightenment in that sense, were making an assault on Christendom. What they were doing was opening up Christendom to the modern understanding of the world and the universe. Once Galileo put his eyes in the telescope, the world was not the center of the universe. We were not a geocentric universe. The universe was far bigger than the planet Earth. And a whole new cosmology emerges, And so with the emergence of this new cosmology comes the Reformation, the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the Enlightenment. And that leads to the rise of Protestantism, still Christian, That is what America is or was until the greatest generation. And within this emerges as the Declaration of Independence, the founding documents of the American Revolution points out, it is about individual rights. It's about the individual to pursue life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. You know, it is about the First Amendment right. You know, you might have your belief, and I have my belief, and this belief is in that sense sacred. You know, the Second Amendment right, the Fourth Amendment right, etc., etc. But now all of that is under attack. So right here we are in this lockdown. Where is my First Amendment right? What happened on Easter Sunday that nobody could go to church? Or what happened in Passover that no Jew could go to a synagogue? But what is happening right now in this month of fasting for the Muslims, and I am a Muslim, and I see and hear that the authorities have given special permission to the Muslim to broadcast their call to prayer publicly in a secular culture. That never happened in 50 years that I have been in this country, or almost half a century. But it is happening now in this lockdown. Well, this is multiculturalism based upon group identity, privileging one group against another group. There goes our rule of law. That is in a sense, the dissolution of our moral center, the moral center that made the West the most unique civilization in the world. It is not simply a problem of the media or of the university. It is of the whole culture that has been upturned by the people in the education institution. Because after all, you know, the man goes or a woman goes from a kindergarten through the education system to become a prime minister. And you can see the difference in a prime minister between an Obama and a John F. Kennedy. Both are Democrats. But what a profound difference in their education, in their values, in their understanding of the world, and in the objective that they're pursuing. John F. Kennedy was a patriotic American. John F. Kennedy stood up eyeball to eyeball against Soviet Union over the Cuban Missile Crisis, and Khrushchev had to back off. Luckily, fortunately, we didn't go into a shooting war. That crisis ended peacefully, but it was John F. Kennedy who stood up. He was a Democrat. In some ways, he was a progressive. But the progressivism had not become a full-blown Marxism as it has become and became under Obama. And so the taking back, which is the 2016 election in America and the win of Donald Trump, America First, I would argue that America First cannot be fully understood and respected unless it is understood and respected, is taking back America to its founding culture in the political sense and in the cultural sense. You know? And people might, you know, scratch their head because we are living at this moment and say, how can it be Trump doing this? But future generation will look back to it if America survives and comes out of this once again, back to the nation state, back to, you know, its own constitutional framework, which is what America is about. America is not about being an imperial power. The last speech that George Washington gave, which is known as his farewell address, he warned Americans not to go out beyond America into foreign ventures that would, in some sense, you know, debase America's value as a land of freedom, as a beacon of freedom. And that is what happened in the period 1960 to 2016 or 2008, Obama's election. America became involved in foreign wars, which was in so many different ways misconstrued and mistaken, now that we can look back upon, you know. It might have done it with good intention, as was the Vietnam War or the Korean War, and subsequently the wars of the Middle East. The worst of the war in that sense was the nation building in Afghanistan and Iraq, which is what President Trump points out. It is not America's business to go nation building around the world. It is America's business from the perspective of the founding fathers, Jefferson and Washington and Madison and Hamilton, that America is engaged with the world, but it's not America's job to go and change the world. America is to remain the beacon of freedom for Americans, so that the world can watch America and take the lesson and see if they can emulate America or not. So what has America done? It has wasted its resources. It has dissolved itself. Ironically, just as World War II ended in Europe on May the 8th, Germany surrendered in 1945. May 8th, 1945, Germany surrendered. And Prime Minister Winston Churchill, in his famous picture that we have, is seen standing up with his finger up, on May 8th, giving salute to the brave men and women of Great Britain for winning the war. 3 weeks later, Churchill was out of office. Churchill had been defeated in the election that was called. And the man who defeated him, Clement Attlee of the Labour Party, was in that sense, a Fabian socialist, and that's the beginning of the West decline, in this case of Britain. Within a matter of less than 10 years, Britain was no longer the empire upon which the sun never sank, It began with the withdrawal from India, then from the Middle East, and very rapidly the British Empire folded up, as I said, within a matter of 10 years. So why did that happen? Very quickly, Britain was exhausted. The British people were exhausted, and they didn't want any more to carry the burden, almost like, Atlas, of Ayn Rand, carrying the burden of the world. Atlas shrugged, Britain shrugged, and the empire was gone. And by default, the Americans took leadership of the world. And for the next 75 years coming now, America, in that sense, put together all the various institutions that has basically managed the affairs of the world, from the UN to the World Bank to the IMF to all the other international organizations. But in this process, the American elite in the academia, in the politics, in business, became obsessed with the idea that it is America's responsibility to create, quote unquote, the international liberal order, which is the birth of globalism. And they shifted their focus from the nation state, that is America, to globalism, which then ironically becomes part of the Marxist agenda. And you can see the conflation that takes place in the period after or during the Vietnam War into our time, that America became more and more, ironically, internationalist, and therefore, to the people on the other side, imperialist. Where America fought the war in Vietnam for freedom, the Vietnamese saw the America's engagement in Vietnam as an imperial power. Where the American tried to bring freedom and help the people in the Middle East or in Afghanistan, the people in Afghanistan and the Middle East saw America as an imperial power, not as a friend and a country trying to help them, come into the modern world. There was a very famous book, Robert, I don't know if you have come across it or you read it. It was later made into a movie with Marlon Brando playing the lead role. The book came out, I believe, sometime in 1967, 68. The title of the book is The Ugly American. Did you hear about that book?
I've heard of it, Salim, but I've never seen it or read it.
Well, I mean, if you've heard about it, I would recommend it, and through you to the audience who might tune into. It's a small book, co-authored Eugene Burdick and William Lederer. I still remember the name of the authors. And the book became a bestseller. The Ugly American. The book came out in the midst of the Vietnam War, and the story is told in a fictional country, which is Vietnam. The fictional country is called Sartham, and it is a Southeast Asian country. And so the Americans are there to help the local people find ways not only to defeat the communists or contain the communists that is penetrating the society, but also help, build up this very poor society in terms of what they need, provide them with the basic needs for their development. And the ambassador, who is in the movie played by Marlon Brando, is there to oversee this. But it all backfires on the American engagement. America is the ugly white man. It is the imperial power. And all that began with goodwill turns up into a huge tragedy in that country. Well, there it is, see. So the American elite didn't take the lesson, didn't pause and think about it. They said, we have to engage more and more. The counter elite, or the voices that emerge, the most important voice was that of Samuel Huntington in the last phase. Before he died, he wrote 2 books. One was The Clash of Civilization, and the other one was Who Are We? And he was warning America, an American. He was a professor at Harvard, a very distinguished man of letters, and he was warning Americans, who are we? I mean, he was talking about the collapse of the American culture, that is, with multiculturalism. The core identity of America was slipping away. Arthur Schlesinger, who was also a Harvard man, a Harvard professor, with Samuel Huntington, both of them have died since. Arthur Hamilton was also the biographer of John Kennedy. He's the one who coined the phrase, the Camelot years for Kennedy. He, in the last years of his life, wrote the book about multiculturalism called Dismantling of America, that multiculturalism would end up, as he said it, dismantling, deconstructing America. That's exactly what we have seen happen, and we are seeing happening. And so in the case of Trump and the 2016 election, and if he wins again in 2020, the issue will be further advanced. But you can see the immense resistance in America by that segment of American elite, the business elite, the global elite, the George Soros, the Michael Bloomberg, the Apple, the Jeff Bezos of Amazon, etc., the Bill Gates. They're all for globalism. They're all for the United Nations. They're all for an open, one world, borderless world. They don't talk about freedom. There is no mention of freedom in their argument. They all have embraced China. They've all have made money off China. They have all offshored the production to China and doesn't have any interest in the working people of America. And there is Trump, and there is the slow resurgence and reawakening. How much it is there, we will see, but of bringing back what America has lost. And what America has lost, or is losing, is what you and I have been talking about. The sense of, the philosophy of the culture of freedom. And freedom means nothing unless it is individual freedom.
It's amazing retrospective, Salim. It looks like we have our work cut out for us. Thank you once again.
Thank you, Bob.